Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 146, Drawing for Digitizers, Compound Shapes and Ornament. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into the Takeup. Glad to have you guys here and happy to have you in for another kind of continued episode on digitizing and details. Kind of like the stuff we talked about last week. We really got into what we can control about stitches and stitch types and carving and everything related to that. But today it's a little bit more about drawing. I'm going to keep it a little short, hopefully a little brief, because I know it is St. Patrick's Day. People have things to do. It's not going to be as populated a day on the show. But for those of you who showed up, I absolutely want to talk about some of the bits and pieces of drawing compound shapes for embroidery digitizing. And what I mean by compound shapes are shapes that are made up of ultimately other little shapes, and how to look at just a complex shape, something that has a complicated outline, even if we're talking about single color work, and break it up into multiple pieces. So that's really kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out a little bit more about what we do with shapes and maybe how we attack these complicated pieces and break them apart into something that's a little easier to handle for different stitch types and in general, just to create something that we can address with the stitches that we're trying to use and to get certain qualities out of them. Part of it was kind of based on the fact that people were talking to me about some of the pieces that I often release around this time. I've got a couple pieces that I've had out there for years. I have some more in a series of what I call acanthus work pieces. I'm going to talk about acanthus and what that means. And they're kind of decorative. They're something you would expect more from decor, something like surface decoration, something that you would see in other kinds of ornament. And these are often done, at least the pieces that I'm talking about, in kind of a satin stitch carved method where we have multiple layers of satin stitches put together to make them what they are. And when we're looking at those, I'm going to go ahead and kind of bring back up the original thumbnail that we started out with today. And you can see some of these pieces are here. On the bottom right hand, there's a heart. On the left hand is a shamrock, the one that I released today. Again, it's been out for a couple of years as a freebie, and I'll show you that again in here in a minute. I'll make sure you guys get a link to that freebie. But these kind of acanthus style pieces, these decorative pieces, these florals and foliate kind of shapes, so foliate looking like leaves. These kind of shapes are stuff that I really like to carve, to separate out into separate satin stitches and layers when I'm doing my embroidery work. And it's something that I've done for lots of different pieces, both commercially, believe it or not, and in tons of the kind of decorative ornamental pieces that I've released as freebies. Not only if you've been around long enough, you've seen some of my Viking Age style stuff. Certainly that also has that. The thing is, when we're talking about stuff like a figure design that has some outlines, most of those shapes are pretty obvious. When we're talking about real structures, and I put those little scare quotes on them, we're talking about breaking something up into real structures. If you have an object that makes sense, even when we're talking about like Viking Age style interlace or Celtic interlace, often we have like an animal with legs. We understand that the legs are objects. We know what they are. Whereas sometimes when we're dealing with a leaf shape or a ornamental kind of abstraction of a leaf or of some other kinds of shapes, we might not immediately be able to identify objects. And we might be looking at a compound shape or an outline or a silhouette where we can't really tell what those pieces are that go together to make the piece. So we have to make decisions about where to draw the line. And in that case, it's not always as easy as saying, well, as I've done with carving before, we have a skull and each of the teeth is an object. So I know that I'm going to make each of the teeth into one satin stitch object that's layered together so that they have a certain texture. They lay on top of each other and then each tooth becomes one shiny satin stitch. Well, the teeth are there. They're in front of me. When we're dealing with something like an ornamental piece where it really is abstracted into a border or a texture, sometimes we don't really have that. And we have to look at the nature of the piece itself and say, all right, where am I going to break it up? How am I going to draw the lines? And that's not always something we can predicate on real structures that would be in the object if it was sitting in front of us. So we'll talk a little bit about all that. And I'll just in general talk about structure and carving and shape building. And some of it is a little bit out of some of the stuff I'm going to teach coming up here shortly at the DAX shows. But it's not all that. It's something that's part of that and part of some of the things we talked about yesterday, or not yesterday, but the last episode. We were talking about shapes and edges and contrast and carving. Well, a good portion of that is literally where do we draw the lines? And when we don't have explicit shapes, structures, or lines drawn in the art, It means that we have to start looking at the nature of the object, the nature of the stitches we want to use or that we're stuck using, depending on what we're dealing with, sizing or the structure itself, and then start to make those separations happen. So that's kind of where we're at. We'll go through a lot of that different stuff as we go through it today, but that's what we're looking at. So we started with kind of where we could control things last week, and we talked about interpretation, but here we're landing into that shape and carving pretty hard. So this is where we're going to be today, is working on kind of shape and carving and what's possible in that space. So once again, I'll bring up some images. We'll talk about that stuff. I'll show you some design stuff and talk about things like object counts. People get really worried about things like how many objects are in a design, or maybe how many objects they're drawing, or do they have to collapse them, or what are they trying to put these things together? And I realize that it can sometimes get kind of heady. You're looking at this piece and saying there's hundreds of objects, but it doesn't mean that they're all very difficult to draw or that there's a problem with that. In fact, the number of objects we've talked about many times before, you use the number of objects you need, and the shape that is sitting there in front of you in the art is very rarely the shape you need for the embroidery, if it's almost never. Almost never is a shape in your art the shape you actually need for your embroidered object in digitizing software, even though that shape does refer to and help us figure out what we need to draw. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about the people who are here. Let's say hi to everybody real quick. You guys know I like to stop and engage with the reciprocators. Cindy King is in early, saying good afternoon. Good afternoon, Cindy. Kingsbury Craft is in, saying hi. Volk Steamworks is in. Looking forward to the topic. Thank you. Glad you're here. Like I said, going to keep it loose today because I know this is not this is the kind of day where people are getting ready to get out and have a fun time. So you never know. Maybe people may or may not be engaged, but if you guys are here, we're going to keep talking. All right, Frank is in from across the pond, UK. Thanks for being here, Frank. Good evening to you. Everybody's saying hi to each other, so I love that. Ramona's saying hi. Hi, Ramona. Happy to have you in. Yes, hi, everyone. Love it. Everybody just getting together and talking to each other. Adelina is in. Hello. And Carolyn. By the way, Carolyn Cagle, who has used some of these designs, I'm going to show one of your pieces from back in the day. Since these have been around for some time, and I actually shared them with you long before they became freebies, I'm going to show something that Carolyn did, which I really love. By the way, hi, Steve. I say hi to everybody when I can. Hi, Jan. Well, let's show one of Carolyn's pieces if I can bring it up really quickly. You guys know that the acanthus shamrock is one of the ones that I've been sharing. Actually, I'll do this real quick. We'll get this business out of the way. Everybody would like to have the freebie. This is something that you can get immediately from the Embrilliance website. If you want to get this, you just need to download the free version of Embrilliance. Unless you have the Embrilliance software, the free version of the platform, you download the platform, you install it, you run the express mode. You can save this into any file you need for your machines. I'm going to go ahead and grab this for you really quickly. This is an old one. I'm going to make some new stuff, but hey, you know what, folks? Because this is still current, people still using it, I'm going to give this away one more time. This piece is over at Embrilliance right now, and it does have the mesh in. This is the piece that Carolyn actually used, and I'm going to show her rendition of it that I love so much. But this is out there free right now. We're going to talk about how it's put together because it's a classic example of this acanthus work that I'm discussing. This looks very much like a Baroque piece to me, but it's actually kind of filtered through a couple of interpretations of my own because this actually started its life as part of a series that started with an acanthus heart. And I'm going to show you that, guys, that in a minute. But the first thing I'm going to say about this is something that my good friend who is here watching right now, Karen Cagle, made, and she made these mittens that I've always loved, her custom mittens, and these have a custom knit band on them as well, which is fantastic. So these were done in panel work, but you just have to love just this. This looks so nice. And I'm not saying like this is my piece that I'm just in love with my own embroidery. Frankly, a good portion of it for me is the awesome like custom knitwork bands on that and the way it was put together, the color choices, fantastic piece. But this is that same acanthus shamrock from an earlier rendition. And I just wanted to show that to you in the real world. And once again, Stricka Knits, that's Carolyn's work. So love that stuff. She's like, the shamrocks and the mesh. Yep. Of course. But like I said, this is now available for you free. Go to that link that was in the comments here, and that's where you're going to get it. So right there, right now, Embrilliance website, archives 2535. That's what you're looking for. But if you search Embrilliance Shamrock, Eric Campbell Shamrock, Acanthus Shamrock, there's not a lot of people who are using the words like Acanthus and Shamrock together. So the likelihood is you'll get to the freebie design if you want it. But and Carolyn says, runs like a charm. Glad to hear it. Suffice it to say, the acanthus work is something that I really like doing. This kind of decorative work that has these carved satin stitches is something that I really enjoy. The thing is that with some of this work, you may or may not be given all of the lines and shapes, because the thing is, looking at the original art that this started from, it does not draw out every little piece of that acanthus work. It does not make it obvious from the get-go where all these pieces are supposed to land. And I think that sometimes people expect it to, or they work on things like they work on vector style art that they're bringing in, and it doesn't have these pieces. It has a silhouette. And when we're working on things that have a silhouette like that, that don't really explicitly have it drawn out, there may be some difficulty in finding the individual objects that are there. And in this particular piece, it does have quite a few objects. This is not a small number of drawn objects that come together to make this piece. So I do admit, yes, if you want something that's going to be carved like that, you're going to have to put in more control points. You're going to have to deal with more edges than if you were just going to try and fill it flat. However, filling something like that flat looks pretty terrible. I just have to put that right out there. It makes your compound fill, your complex fill tool work very hard in your software to go in and out of all of these random insets and holes and shapes, and it really doesn't suit the work very well, whereas the satin stitches, I think, really frankly do. If I pull that up again, you can see this thing is made for satin stitches because the individual objects that I eventually did block out are these long ribbon-like rectangular shapes made for a satin stitch, especially at this scale. Now, you can use things that are not satins to do similar work, but a turning satin or a turning stitch of some sort is going to be perfect for these very ribbon-like, long, cylindrical, if you want to think about it that way, like I said, ribbon or tape-like strokes. They absolutely make sense as satin stitches and make a lot of sense when you break them apart. The thing is, the original art may or may not have that involved in it. So, like I said, we have lots of stuff that we have to cover in this, but I think it's something that's it can be fairly easy to see, but it's something we don't always talk about. Anyway, so we got a couple of people saying hi. I just want to say hi to them. Mark out of Florence, Arizona says, don't forget to hit the like button. Love that. Thank you very much. We've gotten some more subscribers, and I really enjoy you guys being here. So thank you for being here live and commenting. And hello also to Joe Rita. Always glad to see you and see your work. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about these ornaments, right? The first thing is I continually talk about acanthus work. And so I realize that I don't always define these things. So to make this a little more fun and interesting, I'm going to go ahead and stop really quickly to kind of tell you what acanthus is. And when we're talking about ornaments, often acanthus work is some of the most common ornamental work you're ever going to see because it's been around since the classics. So we're talking about, the classical world. So very briefly, I'm just going to bring up straight up the Wikipedia article on acanthus ornament because this is just an easy way to go about it. But the thing to think about first is when I say it's foliate, it really is. This is based from a leaf. An acanthus is a plant. This is what an actual acanthus leaf looks like. We can kind of see this spiky holly-like almost look to it in these separate branches that are coming off of this leaf. So this leaf does have these individual leaflets on it on a central spine. So though this is on top of other leaves that are in it, you can kind of see the shapes that are present in the acanthus. And like I said, it is actually a leaf structure. So when you're looking at acanthus decorative work, it originally comes from this acanthus leaf. So if we look at this acanthus leaf, of course, we're going to say, all right, how the heck does that shamrock have anything to do with that? Well, because we start from something that's actually fairly acanthus-like. This is a classical capital there's a compound capital with a acanthus leaf decoration in it. And we can see when we're looking at this version of the acanthus leaves already, yes, it's becoming stylized, but it is still very leaf-like. Now, there is some actual variation in the acanthus leaf itself. They're not always perfectly symmetrical and everything else. It is a natural object, but we can see that it starts to become a design style. It starts to become a symbolic kind of rendition and not exactly the leaf already in the classical pieces as we see them. But if we go further on, you can see that when we get into later design styles, this starts to look like the acanthus that we understand. When we get down into Baroque and other design styles that are more current to us, we can see we're starting from these other different places, the other different kind of inspirations, and we have different cultural inspiration that goes into this aside from the classical world. But when we get down over here into piece J here, which is where we're getting into like Baroque and Rococo, this kind of acanthus style really becomes current and comes down into absolutely modern decoration all over the place. You'll see surfaces and ribbons and strap work on things that have very similar pieces to this kind of Baroque style that we see in J here. So this is something that, though, yes, it came around the Baroque period, believe me, it is all over the place, and you'll see it in places you might not expect. But as we go through, you can just see that we start from those capitals and columns, and throughout history, we have all these different styles. Here's William Morris, so 1875. Here's an overall wallpaper pattern that's kind of that revival kind of style of that classical work, still fairly acanthus-like, but we can see how these individual leaflets, these structures that are very foliate, they come together to create these larger leaves and swirl into a larger pattern. Now that's an all over kind of cover pattern, but you see a lot of it done in strap work or along areas in trim where we're trying to fill a large ribbon like strap. And so you'll see it in all sorts of different methods and means, from manuscript work, like I said, out into the modern world. And to prove my point about acanthus work being very modern, I'm going to show you something really weird that you're going to say, all right, Eric, I think you're crazy, man. I think you've probably gone too far with this whole acanthus work thing. But trust me, I'm going to have you follow me through this. What you may or may not know is my dad was a mechanic, right? GMC and Chevy truck mechanic. That's really his bread and butter. He can work on anything, had lovely classic cars from the Chevrolet lineup, and we had GM trucks. And this is actually going to become actually something to understand about where I'm going with this ornament showing up everywhere. So I was trying to think when I started deciding I was going to do acanthus as a topic, or at least cover ornamental work and how we draw it as a topic. Where is it that I remember the first time I ever saw this kind of decoration? And you would think, all right, it's something floral, it's a plant, it's something like that. It was probably on some wallpaper or on some, my mother also sewed when I was younger, worked at the time, I think term being seamstress, that people like sewist these days. But you would think, okay, you probably saw like some fabric, and that's the memory that stuck with you about acanthus leaves or some sort of decoration, or maybe the medieval stuff you worked on later on when you're a little older. And I went, nope. If I think back to being a kid, I think it was inside of a truck. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring this back up. Here is a 1970-71 GMC truck door panel. This is a vinyl door panel from a truck, and I don't know if this is the specific one, but I was remembering this sort of pattern on a truck, and I thought, okay, am I crazy? Was there really an acanthus pattern in a truck? Well, yeah. If we look pressed into this vinyl panel right here, there is, for the life of me, something that looks like a Baroque or later kind of acanthus style panel in this truck. And if we bring up one of the other colors here, you can't see it quite as well. We saw the zoom in. If we look all around this square pressed into the vinyl of this 1970s truck, well, that happens to be a very like I said, Baroque style, acanthus style pattern. And that's one of the places I saw it. The other place I remembered was in badging, and I can't remember if the badge is from this truck. I don't think it is. But here we have a Cheyenne. And if we look at this, we do have a little kind of steer skull or steer head here in the middle, or we have that kind of going on. But we've got acanthus style patterns. We have leaflets and foliate patterns coming out on the trim from the side of that truck badge. And I just thought I would share that just to let you know. Yeah, this pattern is everywhere, to the point that if you search for acanthus patterns, start looking in graphics, you will have no end of patterns available, stock designs, vectors, wallpaper, tutorials on drawing it. There will be acanthus in every variety you can imagine. And frankly, that's because it has been used since the classical period as a decoration literally everywhere. So though I say not too many people are drawing acanthus shamrocks for embroidery, suffice it to say, there's tons of acanthus work everywhere. So one of those things that I'm saying, it does appear everywhere. So yeah, it's a weird word. I'm going to say it a million times today. However, what you can see is that scroll work foliate kind of pattern appears so much that it's not uncommon for us to have to work on it when we're digitizing. And it's something that I think is worthwhile. Like I said, kind of funny. I'm glad that you said it was interesting. Vogue Steamworks coming back on. And Carolyn says, makes fabulous coat work. Metallic thread works very well with it. Thank you. But yeah, wallpaper and the truck. Yeah, it's funny. I thought it was funny too, but I tried to think of where it was that I remembered. I kept remembering this metallic leaf pattern. Where was it? It was on the badge in the inside of the truck. But yeah, Carolyn says looks great with old root beer dripped on it, right? Pretty much. Very cool deep dive. Hey, I thought that was fun. I like the deep dives, but we're going to get back into the digitizing portion. But yep, Curtis says trim the door panel from the same trucks. Yeah. So yeah, that's like I said, spend some time in a truck. And B says, good morning from Tasmania in Australia. Glad to have you here as well. And forgive my weird truck talk. But I get to the truck talk so that I can actually run from that back to the acanthus patterns and how we digitize them, right? But let's go ahead and grab just a few more images from some of the stuff that I've done to kind of show you other acanthus patterns I've worked on. Like we said previously, one of the first ones was actually this acanthus heart. Originally came without a mesh insert, so it's a single color heart rendered in satins. You can see how that very directly relates to and becomes the visual style that gave us the acanthus shamrock that I showed you just a second ago. But it comes from artwork that often looks a bit like this. This is an original sketch from that same heart shape. But as you can see with the pieces that are here, though we do have a fair amount of the visual language of it, if we look inside some of these areas, there's not a lot of detail to be had. When we're looking at these kinds of styles, yes, the leaflets are kind of shaped out, but we don't have the entirety of the detail. We don't have everything we need for our actual embroidered pieces. This looks like one continuous piece. The edge is put together, but we don't have every stroke enumerated. Not every satin stitch is already placed where it needs to be. And though I think most people understand that we're going to be doing some things like this, some of this carving, some of this separation, people don't always talk about how they come to that decision and what really goes into it. So I think that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. We actually have some other detail and some other things to discuss. Obviously, when we're looking at decorative pieces like this is one of the several pieces I did for a home chapel where the guy wanted to do papal coats of arms. So these are of the last three popes. But what I wanted to point out is, as we can see again, that same acanthus detail is being used for the edge of the shield here and in multiple areas of the shield, as well as having some other central kind of foliate themes that are similar. But once again, in the original art, none of these individual satin stitches are enumerated. Only the outer shape of the acanthus leaf is shown. So it's something where you're going to have to make decisions. Same thing when we talk about even kind of like these quatrefoils, any of these shapes where we're dealing with a single color. Could you select to make these out of a flat fill? You certainly could, but they are a bit more effective and more eye-catching. Any of these kind of pieces, including what we're talking about here with this fringe. This is the end of this rope and the rope itself. They look a little more interesting if we use our satin stitches, our dimensional carving, to give them more detail, to give them dimension. So we can see throughout this piece that we have lots of areas where we could use flat fills, but we decide to take hints from the shapes. But like I said previously, when we're dealing with something like this key here, I can say to myself, all right, looking at the edges that do exist in the art, we do have enumerated the edges of this key with the kind of gateways that are in it. It's not a big jump for me to decide to make this front face of the key a separate satin stitch overlapped with this top face of the key as a second satin in a different angle. The vertical angle on this front face and this angle that matches the rest of the ends of the key on this face that's on top. That's not a big jump. Why is it not a big jump? Because I have actual real structures. A lot of the time when we're doing carving, if we're lucky, we will have, like I said, we'll have these what I call real structures, meaning that if the key was a real thing sitting in front of me right now, these real structures would exist. I can look at the edges, I can look at the key and say, a key has a spine, a spindle, a handle of some kind. It has the gateways on it. It has these various pieces that are obvious to me, and I can use the real structures to make something out of them in these stitch types that I'm using. Now, I'm going to admit, when we're looking at this one, I'll pull that down again so you can kind of see it. When we get into areas like the end of the key here, up at the upper left here of the image, where it is just an outright piece without necessarily having outlines in it in the art, I am starting to use cues that I'm going to talk about with other parts of these designs. I'm using cues from the edge as I go through this piece, and I know that the key, I do think about the real structures, but I'm not necessarily seeing them in the art. I can at least say, though, all right, here is the main kind of body, the shaft of the key. And I know that if this thing is done in such a way that's very much like a turned piece on a lathe, even though that's not how it's made, you can say, all right, it's likely going to have these ovoid areas. As I can see these lines, as I'm following the edge of the shape that's there in the original art, even if it's a single color, I can see insets here. I can see these individual stepped areas, and I can make the decision that this portion may be part of that central the central kind of body of the key, but these pieces that stick out to the edges, I'm going to go ahead and use a satin stitch turned horizontally to the rest of the body in order to make these individual ridges. And I'm going to kind of overlap them because I'm thinking of them like a real structure on both sides here. I'm saying, all right, so I do have this kind of central spine of this key, but then if I've got these areas and they are almost like a turned table leg, I can imagine that each one of these pieces should be separated or can be separated for effect. And actually, that is very similar to how we deal with the acanthus work, because though it is not a real leaf, we do think of it like a leaf, even when it's abstract. And we say, all right, if we have these kind of leaf-like shapes with these individual leaflets, and we plan it for layering for dimension, then we can understand that each one of these leaflets will be an individual satin stitch element. And then the way we work on layering and line is to take hints from the shapes that are there that do exist in the art, even when the art is flat. We look at these edges and say, all right, where I come to a dip, an inset, there's a likelihood that I'm going to be trying to split something here. And if I think about the shape of a leaf, even though this is not necessarily really shaped as an actual leaf, if I think about the way that the structure is put together, and I take into consideration the fact that a satin stitch can be about a certain width. It's something that is supposed to be narrow. It is not generally used to fill a large, flat, wide area. Well, then those individual leaflets make sense as those satin stitches, and it starts to be more obvious how I would break these apart. We have the individual leaflet, and also we then think about the overall travel. So what I'm going to show you is that this piece starts here. If we start here, we start to separate these leaflets, and we think about how we're going to return to the main body of each kind of sub branch on this piece. So we have an individual leaflet, then we'll stitch one side and the other here, feather that into the main body, go down to here. We get this isolated leaflet, then this piece that's sticking off. This one then has continuity with the next swoop, and again here. And then we work that into the body. We understand that eventually we're going to have to travel up that side. We're going to be traveling up the entire piece, layering it from kind of the central, furthest extending tip of that leaf shape up throughout this acanthus path. And as you can see, we just go whenever we hit a place where I can tell that I'm going to have to split. In this case, it looks like I've got a nice leaf shape here, and I realize I'm coming up to some sort of junction. There's a small bump in the original artwork. And I'm going to jump out, say, all right, I've got leaflets. I make one leaflet here. I make the second one, and then I go back and complete the section, and I do the same repeatedly. And acanthus work honestly becomes fairly meditative, because once you've gotten it started, as long as you kind of know your overall sequence, I mean, you know things like this one, of course, the rope is underneath this work. The work on the edge of the shield is some of the last work that gets done. But once we decide on that piece, we essentially work on it kind of in reverse of the way a plant grows, right? A plant has that kind of that apical, that tip, that final end of it, that bud that's coming out of the end of the branch and continues to grow on. We work from that tip back fairly often because we want to layer on these leaves. If we think about how leaves grow and then how another leaf comes out from that central area, then we know that we're working that way in reverse when we're doing that layering to make it have this kind of depth. So like I said, leaflet, and we keep on fulfilling that until we get to the next place where we have an inset. So if we're looking at the outside of this shape without seeing necessarily all of these lines, we can stop and say, all right, I've got insets, I have corners and points, and I can tell where I'm going to have curves. So we start to break things up. And I think even on complex shapes, something is something similar is happening on any of these shapes. If we look at this star that's here, that of course, that is not something that you would worry about as far as trying to figure out the shapes. But if we think about the star and go, all right, well, I obviously wanted these satin stitches for these narrow, long points. where they come to a junction, I'm going to have to figure out how to get that junction into the center. In this case, these are all overlap satins. So you know that I'm going to be underneath this next satin stitch, and this one's going to go on top of this edge. And depending on how you do it, in fact, in this case, I've run the 4 in the back first, and then I believe I ran these 4 that are on the 45-degree angles last, so that I could overlap them and have some kind of interesting texture as far as the dimension inside of the center here. But the same thing that I'm doing here is what I'm doing with the acanthus. When I come to a point where we have an inset, of course, I understand that I'm going to carry that split in. I'm going to carry that line. So whatever we're working on, whether it's just simple acanthus work or it's something like this, and even if it's something graphical, I think that there's something to be said for paying attention to the edge and breaking it up into logical shapes. It doesn't always have to be something that's realistic, but we're lucky in that when we're dealing with some ornament, like the acanthus ornament, we do have real structure, right? When we're dealing with something that has leaves or a foliate structure like a plant, we can treat it somewhat like a plant. It does have some real structure. Now, the more abstract that shape gets, the less the real structure necessarily can help us. If it is something that is absolutely realistic, like when you do work from something that is an actual shape that you might look at, that is like a silhouette of a person. Well, obviously we have limbs, we have head and face and body, and we have all these structures involved that we know what they look like and where they should be. And we follow the lines of those structures. When we're dealing with something that's more abstract and decorative, you may or may not have all of those structures, like I said, to lean on. It may not be there to inform you about those decisions. Though, like I said, a lot of these do have some structure that can help you along and make that work for you. And in fact, much of this is stuff that I will do in the embroidery software while I'm digitizing. I'm not always pre-drawing these shapes. So though I called this drawing for digitizing, I don't think you necessarily have to be drawing this stuff ahead of time. And especially when we're talking about acanthus work, something where it is a fairly common decorative element, you will start to learn the structure of how this stuff is put together. And then if you encounter it in your digitizing, the likelihood is you're not going to stop and draw out all of your edges. You're just going to follow that kind of structural method of work as you go through it. But in order to kind of show some of that stuff, I think I'm going to go ahead and let's grab the acanthus heart and we'll run through it, the design. I think sometimes it's fun just to discuss that stuff and talk about the objects that are present. So we're going to go ahead and grab that up on screen one more time and say, all right, here is our acanthus heart. Here is a version of it, at least. I've done more than one. And this one, in fact, I went back to the original art and made this more asymmetrical. I actually wanted it to be more like the original art. So what you're going to find is instead of a copy and paste from the left to the right side, the left and right sides are slightly different and follow the original art to the point of having slightly different structures. We see here are these 3 leaflets that are separated. Over here on the right-hand side, the leaflets are done in a different way. So let's go ahead and run through it. I'm just going to show you the design running and kind of explain it. Certainly the other thing I want to show you very quickly, though, again, 139 objects. So it seems like an awful lot, but for each one of those objects, I think it's well worth it for the texture that you're getting. Let's go ahead and just kind of sweep through this piece. We're going to just grind through it. First thing you're going to see is this one does have a lace background placed into it. That is just decorative. We don't necessarily need that lace background. That is just there in case you liked that textural variation in that color. But let's go through the pieces themselves. You see we're starting in the center. We have those individual pieces that are in that center. So individual leaflets that are then covered by a central spine. And we go down to the bottom, leaflets in the spine. And again, as we get into each of these pieces, we stop and work leaflets first and then the central area that carries us back to that piece that we were working from. So individual leaflets and then back to that original stroke. We'll go through it a little faster, then I can zoom in on some of these. So invariably, we're building back toward that covering stitch at the edge because we know that's going to be kind of our final edge that gives this the most definition. Work into the center, individual leaflets, cover those up. And in this case, then the structure is very similar, going back the other direction. But each individual piece has these leaflets that go back to the covering stitch and then back out and work to the edge. Like I said, this becomes very meditative, becomes something that you can do almost sleepily because you can start to understand how these structures are put together. The individual leaflets build up to those central leaves that carry you on, the strokes that carry you on to the rest of the design. And I think what may be interesting about this is that In doing so, it does kind of grow very organically, but we can see in the individual pieces that it does have a sensibility to the structure. We go out to that tip and then build back, covering over those edges until we get to the spine that travels on. And I find that working these is also kind of similar to working on red work or any kind of engraving style work, where we have to watch every line and make sure we only cover 2 times as we come in and out to get the thickness to be the same. That kind of work is very similar in that we are traveling out, we're aware of the direction of travel, and we're usually looking to find our way back to the main path. So in single color acanthus work like this, you're usually doing that same kind of work where you're traveling out in a pass or out to the end of a stroke and then working back in. And honestly, it's a fairly natural kind of process, and we think about it, it grows naturally. Now in this piece, this is the acanthus shamrock, and you can see already that these are absolutely, the shapes that are here are born out of the shapes here. This was the original piece, and the acanthus shamrock I actually recreated and made this piece based on the heart, because originally, you're not going to believe this, these were going to be a set of card suits. You were going to get a spade once upon a time, and it didn't happen. The acanthus shamrock was actually a club as well. There was a thought for a while there. I first did this, and then I made this piece, and it was intended to be a shamrock. But somebody then said, "Oh, you should do an entire series." And so part of the reason I was so careful about the graphical style is that there was eventually at some point going to be some sort of acanthus diamond and some sort of acanthus spade. I did not do that. I decided that I liked these pieces as they were, and I actually didn't really like the idea of the card suits, though somebody really did want me to do it at one point. Suffice to say, I don't even recall where that came about and where those thoughts were from. But at this point, they live on their own. There's been other acanthus pieces that are unrelated. I actually have like the acanthus hoodie piece, and here's the vertical from that, and I'll show you that acanthus hoodie again in a second. I've done a couple of trees. I've done a couple of other pieces in a similar portion, and I see Ramona is already, I know, trying to get me back on the course. She says, it's not too late. You can still do it. I might. It might happen. You never know. But yeah, the ornaments, the Carolyn made these Christmas ornaments that were lovely, but I never got through with the rest of those pieces. So yeah, I feel bad because sometimes I'm like, oh, they look good on their own, and I don't know how to do the diamond. I don't know if I can get that done. So I did other stuff. But suffice it to say, these were lovely pieces, and the idea, it halfway I didn't know what to do with it, and halfway I got onto other things. But suffice to say, let's take a look at the shamrock. I do love the way this piece turned out. Once again, with the mesh, if you prefer it. But if we look, it has a very similar kind of concept. These leaflets are done on the side first, and then we have that central spine. And you'll see that it leaves room for everything to overlap on top of it and cover. So those leaflets cover up, but we do leave room for this continuous curve here. And that's something I'm going to talk about again in a second. And we can see that same kind of organic structure is maintained throughout, where we work toward that eventual travel into the final piece. And the thing on this piece is you can actually see it was worked in such a way that each one of these elements is essentially the same as the next element on the piece. They are pretty much an echo of themselves around this piece. So you don't actually have anything different happening. What you do have is slightly different layering throughout the piece, but it was actually intended to kind of roll around the shape in a cycle. We can see that this edge is on top of this one, and the same thing here. It is meant to rotate around that shape. You could totally do it in a different way where you sequenced it and had the top element going to the front, but I actually like the idea of rotating it around that stem. But we can see that same kind of structure is being done here, where we have the individual leaflets that go out to the piece and finish out into those edges and create an individual segment that then can be repeated. So one of the other things I want to make clear to you guys is that when you do something that's ornamental like this, if you think you can't, just copy this piece and paste it along. If it's self-contained like this piece is, with this overlap that's based on where that final piece is done, absolutely, it can make sense to copy and paste and rotate. These pieces are essentially the same from one element to the next to the side. Now, admittedly, on the acanthus heart, this version is asymmetrical. One of the earlier versions that I did, however, I used every piece of this top curve, copied it, pasted it, and flipped it, and just traveled down to the bottom and went back up to the top. You can do that, and especially in ornamental work, it's not necessarily as grating. In this case, I wanted it to look more like that original artwork piece that I showed you. And that original artwork piece was not symmetrical. It was not entirely symmetrical. So I went with an asymmetrical piece. But if we look at one of the original renditions, this is not the same file that you were looking at earlier. This one is symmetrical from the left to the right. Whereas the final piece that you were looking at on screen here, this one, you can see that the internal structure of the leaflets on the left and the right are different because I went back to the original art and redigitized it to make that piece happen. So I can see somebody says that they were sad that I didn't finish the other pieces. And certainly Carolyn says, do it. I might. I just might. I do like doing acanthus work quite a lot. And as I just explained, you can absolutely do some copy and pasting. So maybe I should take my own suggestions here and do a section and try and work these pieces out to make them faster for me to digitize. Suffice it to say, though, yes, the acanthus shamrock, the acanthus heart, both come from a very similar place. But it is worthwhile kind of looking at this and saying these could be done differently. You don't necessarily have to split them where I split them. It is an artistic choice to do. What I will say, though, is that if you look at a complex shape like this and you try and render it out as something that doesn't have that complexity to it, if we look at a shape that's not broken apart, not only is it technically not as good, in my opinion, it doesn't run as well, but it also doesn't have that same look. I like to consider these compound shapes from the get-go. I think that they are made of separate elements, and I think they look best in embroidery when they're treated that way. So let's talk really briefly about something that I teach in some of my classes, is shape building, right? So we talk about shape building. There's two kinds of shape building, and it's something that, ultimately I think we'll kind of have to disambiguate really quickly, and I'll do this like I do in my classes. When I talk about shape building, some people will think about the vector style shape building, which is where we take a tool like the Pathfinder and we can slap multiple pre-drawn shapes together and we can fuse them or cut them out and arrive at a final shape. In this case, that's what I'm showing here. This is in Stitch Artist 3 where we have this path tool. That is one thing that is often called shape building, but in the case of what I'm talking about here, that's not what we're discussing. That's usually when we're talking about vector art. That's shape building and vector art. But when I'm talking about shape building, I'm talking about building complex shapes that appear as a single continuous area from multiple embroidered elements. And that's the thing we're talking about here. If we looked at the outside edge of this piece, fairly obviously, I think that this is a worse rendering all day long than this. I think if we take a vector shape like this and slap a fill stitch on it, can it render? Yes, it can. Is it possible to render it? Yes, it is. Will this have a tremendous number of travel stitches underneath it? Very likely, because if we think about how this fills. Now imagine that I'm starting the fill down here at the bottom of the shape. I'm ending it up here at one of these curls, and we have a horizontal fill stitch. What's going to happen when it reaches any of these shapes that dip down below one of these cuts? Well, it's going to start here and start filling. And then the software is going to have to travel down to here and fill a little bit, and down here and fill a little bit, go back up here. Maybe it fills down to here, and then it finally meets the other portion and starts going back up. And then it comes over here and it fills some of this and some of this, and it's going to travel up, down, left, right, constantly trying to find the line as it tries to fill this piece from top to bottom with a horizontal angle. This piece is going to be tremendously inefficient on the machine. I know what people will say, though, is, hey, I can put this down in 3 clicks, whereas this one takes me those hundreds of shapes to make that happen. Now, as I said, in this particular piece, you only have to make one side if you plan it out correctly, because you make one side and then jump over here, travel back down to the bottom, and sew the other side. You can copy and paste. However, even with those shapes involved, what I'm going to say is, not only is the visual look of the compound piece much better, but the stitch count's going to be lower. It's going to be very efficient on the machine. So this one, very efficient for you as a digitizer if you don't mind the fact that it's flat and kind of awful. And yes, I'm saying kind of awful because I feel like this just is not the best rendition possible in embroidery. But yes, this can be done by dropping an SVG file into your software, saying start and end, and setting one line of fill stitch. However, it's going to be inefficient. The software cannot help but travel all over to try and make this shape happen. Even if we break it up, we can only limit the amount of travel so much if we're going to keep that single fill stitch angle. So if we start breaking it apart at all, I feel like if you're going to start separating this out into multiple objects, then you might as well go to the point of separating out into objects that make sense. So when we're talking about compound shapes, this is what I mean, that when we're looking at this edge, we know, despite the fact that we have one edge with one big hole in it, we can understand from looking at the edges of the shape what we're trying to get, that we want something that's actually built up of multiple shapes. And in this case, because we know what a satin stitch looks good for, what it does well, which is a long ribbon-like shape, and we know that the contrast we can get from different stitch angles being next to each other is going to give us all of this depth, because this is one color of light old gold rayon thread that you're looking at here. So this is one color of thread. In fact, this is one filament. These are, well, two filaments thread. There's one piece of bobbin and one piece of top thread, because there are no jumps, trims, or anything else going on in this piece. This is one piece of thread. It does not jump or trim. We know that there's no other colors. Why are we getting all this lovely color, this shadow, these highlights? We're getting it because we have real dimension, because the angle of the stitch is going to show differently depending on where the light source is at, and the light is going to change how it's reflected depending on that stitch angle, and because we have a sheen on our thread. So with that in mind, these compound creations made up of these smaller strokes, and I love to use that term, these smaller strokes, if we think of strokes of a brush or strokes of a pen, and I'll get back to that again, those easily identified shapes that we can see here are going to make a better call, especially for satin stitch. Now, yes, there's tons of things that are best done in fill stitch, and we can use fill to also get these angles. But the place that I'm talking about it now, when we're talking about ornamental pieces like this, and especially referring to the shamrock that kind of people were asking me about kind of breaking down, satin stitches are going to be primarily what we're using for this kind of piece at this size. Now, granted, satins aren't the only way to do that. And in fact, one of the pieces that people also know from me that has gone under that acanthus kind of banner again is a piece that has them done in what is not necessarily a satin stitch. I like to use satin likes. We talked about them last time. Split or length limit stitches are where we usually have those kinds of look. And it's something that I think is worthwhile to kind of look at, right? The concept of these satin-like split stitches, length limit stitches, gives us the same shine and sheen, and essentially it's a turning stitch. So anytime we have a column type shape, a ribbon type shape, and we turn that stitch angle as we move through the shape, those kinds of turning stitches, even if they aren't satin stitches, of course, whenever we change stitch angle, whether it's a fill or satin, we're going to get a difference in the way that light reflects off of it. And so it can still provide that kind of depth, that kind of imagery, that kind of detail. So the one that I'm talking about here, there's a couple different images. This is the hood on the piece. I call it the acanthus hoodie. It's a piece that I made for my wife really early back in the day, and was kind of showing the power of kind of colored metallic thread with this concept of using compound shapes and carving. And we'll zoom in on this piece and we can see this is the front panel along the front of the hood. We do have two colors here. We do have a dark green and a light green being used offset. We do have different colors. Now, this one just has the greens in the front. If we look at the monogram, we have some other colors and a super twist thread as well being used. And yes, we've got some scatter placed rhinestones as well. But if we look at the shape, we can see that here are these satin-like shapes, and we're using that same leaflet kind of work. What you will notice is that this curved tip on this piece, instead of being underneath, is actually on top. I decided to make this curl on top and change the order of the stitches just slightly and add some more color steps so that I could put this curve on top and get this unbroken kind of stroke that's in the back. Once again, what we're looking at is where these edges meet, and we're looking for those shapes. And the one thing I want to kind of make clear about this, how do we find some of those shapes? Well, certainly we're going to look at the edges of the art. If we look at the edges of the art, when we see insets, we can look at those insets and areas where there are corners and say that's probably where we're going to see some sort of breaking. But the other thing is when we're trying to determine the line, what I'm often looking for is continuity. And I'm going to show you in some other examples later, but just to kind of keep this in your mind, that it's the continuity of line. If I'm looking at these two leaflets and they are not separated in the art, there's no seam along the back end of these, and I have to decide where this line goes, what I'm looking for is a continuous curve that defines the shapes and ends where I want it to end. And if we look at some of the other pieces that we've discussed earlier, that continuity is really kind of borne out repeatedly in the piece, right? If we're looking at these pieces, we can see that it's the continuity of line. If a line exists, even if we don't see the entirety of that line, we can say, all right, as that line exists, I'm going to be looking for a continuity of that line, even if it's organically getting a little larger, a little smaller, even if there's some variation in it, I'm going to continue the line. And when we're looking at leaflets like we have up here that don't have a lot of definition, we can stop and say, all right, I have this leaflet here. I have to decide which one is on top. And it might not be obvious. We might look at the piece and say it's not obvious, but I have this curve, and I decide which one's on top. In the case of this actual piece, we can take a look at the final piece and say, all right, I decided that this small leaflet was going to run first underneath this leaflet. In this case, I decide that this curve is continuous and goes over top of this smaller leaf. So I stitch this leaf first and then look for the continuity of line between this point and this point, which is my next corner. And we can see I do the same thing here. This corner and the outside line here, where these start to curve back, I'm looking for continuity and for that curvature not to have any real big breaks in it or big angular changes. So continuity of line is one of the things we're looking for when we're breaking that up. And invariably, we look at any of these pieces. Here's the other portion of that. The hoodie, here's the monogram that's on the hood. And we can see that same kind of thing is being carried out here. If we just have these shapes and we don't have this internal line, where what I'm looking for is a continuity between where this starts to change into this other piece. There's a slight little bump here. We can see that that's where these come together. I look at the inset on the top, and then I look at where that has to travel into a curve where I want a continuous smooth curve, and I maintain that continuous smooth curve to the point where I want it to meet. Now, in this case, on these, I decided to have a small split here. I didn't want them to fuse into one line. Often you'll see that one is just fully on top. In this case, I wanted them to fuse. And because I wanted that central distinct line to continue cutting through this stroke that's toward the back of each of these leaflets, I went ahead and pulled that in and made the continuous curve go toward this midpoint here in the line. But suffice to say, it's the same thing that we do when we're looking at lettering. And I think one of the best ways we can kind of exercise this, this kind of eye for embroidery for finding the continuous curves, is to work on lettering. Lettering is a single color object that often is done in satin stitches, and it really can help us to find those edges. And we see the same kind of thing is happening with this letter. This letter did not have a separate stroke, but because we know that a satin stitch makes a ribbon-like object, we can see this super twist, kind of a Lombardic C that we're using here, that I went ahead and found the continuity of curve so that this final object, this stroke that connects on the far edge here of the C, and yes, I know it's a weird C that it has a connection, but that's how that C is drawn, that for this to be a continuous stroke, I followed that curvature and let it go on top of the other stroke that makes up the main body of the C, this main bowl here. So we can see that that continuity of curve is what makes this final satin stitch that goes on top of the earlier satin come together, right? And here we see it actually on my lovely wife, as you can see it modeled. But we can see how much that curvature and the turning satin stitches, we talked about this last week, really does create this very high density of shadow and this really bright highlight depending on that curvature, and when it's worn on a person, it's very obvious. It's the same kind of thing I'm looking for on a complex shape too. We talk about real structures. Even though this piece did have some actual painterly, it was a photograph of a mask that I was using. If we look at where we're going, all of this continuity is the same kind of concept. With real structures, it's a lot easier. But if we see that this upper lip, we want it on top of this jawline, we can see that we're following this line through. So a lot of this is about following lines through. In this case, it's much more abstract. It was something that I was doing specifically to show off texture. But if we have this curvature that is present, a lot of these lines just follow through. They follow the shapes that are existing in the piece, and we use that follow through because in this case, the edges were enumerated. But when they're there, then it makes sense. It's a lot easier to see it. But when they're here, we don't necessarily have them. In this case, there weren't all of these leaflets being enumerated separately, even though I did go back in and draw myself a central spine. That isn't how I actually ended up finishing the piece. You can see that what I did, I elected, instead of using the curvature that was in the line that was drawn on this original art. Well, actually, it's a transparent piece. Let me back it all out so I can have the original. If we look between these two, when I started to deal with the curvature of this leaflet, because I knew I wanted two separate leaflets, rather than follow this central curvature that was here, I decided to go with a curvature that followed that structure and that was continuous because I was layering it out much more in a leaf-like pattern. So in this case, I actually went contrary to some of the original artwork that I had seen in order to make a piece that made more sense for the satin stitches that were being used. And when those lines don't exist, it makes a lot more sense to find that continuous curve. So, like I said, continuity is one of the things I'm looking for. I'm looking for hints at the edge or edge quality. So we have the edges. So we're looking for insets. We're looking for texture. We're looking for elements on the edges that make sense for us to cut. We're looking for continuity of curvature in the line. You can do it in other ways. You could do it without that continuity. We could have split it right down the middle. You can elect to do it, but if you don't know where that line is and you're looking for the line, it's not making sense. A great way to handle it is to try and continue the curve without breaking that curve. And of course, we want to look at, if we have the ability to look at shapes that are sensible, then we might want to look at things like real structure, or at least the way certain structures are made. In the case of the acanthus leaves, it's something that is like a plant-like structure. In the case of something that's more abstract, you might not have that. And in fact, if we look at some other shapes, so like I said, I think lettering is one of the best ways we can study that for sure. It's something that I often think about. And when we talk about interlace, lettering and monograms have interlaced or overlapped areas, and we can kind of look at it in that fashion as well. So it really kind of depends on what you're trying to work from. But like I said, we see it in multiple ways. If we're looking at something that has realistic structure, well, then obviously, if you guys have seen me talk about carving, then you can carve real structures that are present. You can carve objects because they make sense. We can carve objects because they are literally part of the human being that we're trying to break apart. We can see that we've got this silhouette, and I know that there is a dress and there's legs and there's arms. See, so we don't have to worry quite so much there. But even when we look at it here, we are still looking at cues from where these edges are. We're looking at the way the shoulder hits the neck. I can see that I've got curvature in the hair. Well, then I can assume where the hair and the brow line is to some degree. I can see that where the arm meets the body. Well, if the arm is behind the body, I go and look at where the shoulder is, where the bust line is, and I break the piece apart there. And then I use separate textures to get myself some detail between the two. And we also make some decisions about who is in front here. In this case, the woman on the right is in front of the woman on the left. So you can see that I've decided to keep her arm continuous and let it run over the woman's arm on the left. So these are still happening in other shapes. I think in abstract shapes, it becomes much more much more impressive to people. They kind of look at it and don't understand where it comes from. But the truth of the matter is, it shouldn't necessarily be impressive. It's more that we look at cues and then we make decisions. In some cases, you're going to make decorative decisions that have nothing to do with the lines that are there, but we are looking at source material. And that's what you usually see me talk about. But when we're talking about acanthus work, well, acanthus work is not necessarily going to have a bunch of source material. And if we have something that is completely decorative, that is used as a surface texture, then we really are just, using our own best judgments. And in fact, some things don't necessarily have a right or a wrong way. And we're just looking to make them look the best we can make them look. And I think certainly it depends on what's most important to the kind of work that you're doing. And like I said, I think that when we're looking at different kind of interlaces or different kinds of textures, then sometimes we have different options. But lettering, I do think, is kind of one of my best ways to kind of train that. And I'll go ahead and bring up some slides really quickly just to kind of explain that yet again, to kind of make it clear what I mean by that. I think that building glyphs, satin stitch lettering, is one of the best ways to kind of train yourself on these shapes, because we have the concept of separating strokes. If you heard me talk about building lettering or digitizing fonts, I always talk about the fact that most of the lettering we know, especially the classic forms of lettering, they are born out of things like penmanship, calligraphy, and calligraphy, broad stroke, broad nib strokes from a calligraphy pen are how these things are broken up. If we look at how a calligrapher would draw a letter, we actually have these individual strokes that come together that make the letter. Now, the sequences are different because picking up the pen is normal for them, whereas we don't want to constantly pick up the needle. We don't want to do jumping and trimming. However, if we look at the way the strokes are separated, very similar to the way we separate strokes for satin stitches. But then if we look at this again, thinking about this edge and continuity, well, what can we decide? We've decided that a satin is the basic element, that it is ribbon-like, and that each of these strokes being unbroken is important to the look. And we can say, all right, if we come to a corner, that's probably somewhere where I'm going to be looking for a continuous stroke. In the case of these calligraphy, they wrote the central bar of the A last. In the case of embroidery, we often run it first. because we're traveling and trying not to jump and break, right? We're trying not to jump and trim. So we do the central bar of the A first, then this back stroke, then this decorative flag on the top, and we finish it out toward the right because we're generally stitching left to right, not always, but we're doing that logically. And we can also see that part of this decision, the decision that this digitizer made, now this is some stock lettering from an older software that I had. They didn't go with full continuity. They decided to have something that was much more, I would say, like a miter. We talked about mitered corners last time around, but you have this kind of line that is drawn in continuity from this junction point to the left-hand side of the satin stitch stroke, with the smallest stitch here being set to what they felt comfortable with as the smallest stitch in that satin stitch. Now, I don't think this is a perfect rendition, but you can see that even in stock lettering that was been around forever, there's a concept that's very similar. We're looking for that continuity of curvature. We're trying not to break that corner up. And when we're doing it artistically, there's usually a thought about the strokes and the order in which they stitch. And we're doing them in a way that layers kind of reasonably. And even when we don't have calligraphic strokes, this is from a lettering set that I've worked on, something that it was a private project, may or may not be released. But this particular one had some interesting things to look at. If we look at the original art from the True Type font that originally this piece kind of came from, we can see that we've got some interesting bracketing up into the serifs. So this is a serif letter F. It does have serifs on it. But we can see that these serifs are really rounded. We had to make some changes. We had to cut these off. So at the shortest stitch for the smallest recommended size, we don't end up with really teeny tiny stitches that have to be filtered out. So these are cropped. So that's one thing we had to think about. But then we had to separate into strokes. I decided that I wanted a continuous stroke on the top. I wanted a cross bar. I didn't want to be turning around this really wide area here. If we were doing a turning stitch where the angle continued to turn and it went completely on this same angle through this piece, we're going to have a really strange kind of inset. Because we have this kind of interior curve, because of this really long stitch here, I wanted to break this into two pieces. So besides that, we also have, of course, the central bar of the F being broken out into a satin stitch. We can see here, got a central bar and it's tipped in. We have this angle here to prevent some of the splitting that happens when this satin stitch runs on top of it. This does have a rounded bottom to the letter, but it does taper, but it is cropped at the end. So we don't have this really tiny taper that we have over here on the actual original font. But then when we get up into this piece, we're looking at the serif and we have to make a couple decisions. First, a technical decision. We're cropping here and we're cropping it and tilting this angle so that at the smallest recommended size, this stitch doesn't go about under a millimeter. Right around 0.8 millimeters to a millimeter. So it's a good size for 40-weight thread to still run at the smallest recommended size. Same thing over here on the right-hand side. And then we have to break apart this curve. And what you can see is I'm taking a couple different things into consideration and breaking this apart. First, there is continuity. I'm looking from this back point, the end of the stroke, and I'm trying to find a nice shape to finish at the junction between these two satins. And I'm looking at all the rest of this letter and saying, all right, well, I've got some bracketing here. There's curvature. I have this nice sweep down here at the bottom of the F. I want something that's going to look interesting and artistic and make sense as the way this thing is split. So you can see that I've decided to curve that line. It could have totally been a straight line here, but I think that's kind of where this piece falls apart a little bit, where we have this straight line from the center of the A straight up to the top. And it's this really kind of jarring line where it might have been better to continue it from this area, or maybe even to round it out a little bit because of all these other sweeps and curves that are in the piece. This straight cut between the two looks a little bit jarring. In this case, I went ahead because this piece also can run quite large. This font can run pretty large before we have issues with the width of the satin. I want to see that curvature. And I went ahead and kind of echoed some of that curvature that I'm seeing in the rest of the piece. So I curved that line just a little bit. So what we're thinking about is this. We're thinking in strokes, realizing that each one of these satin stitches separated makes sense to us as an object. And we're looking for continuity of line or continuity of line, said that weird, hinted at by those edge features. And I think building any compound shape has a similar kind of work. We're looking for continuity. We're looking for a line that's unbroken. And we're still, of course, doing the things we were before, which is trying to create dimension through having stitch angles vary from piece to piece. We're trying to have some structure involved in that. We're getting texture. And when we're building our glyphs, we are, like I said, we're thinking in strokes And we are trying to make some of that dimension by breaking them up in a way that's interesting. But the way to get that line to look the way we want to is to think about continuity. I think that's one of the ways we do it. Could we do it jagged? Yes. We can do anything we want artistically. But if it's something where we can see the elements in the rest of the art, we can kind of get an idea for what we're working on. We can say, all right, continuity not only of the line, but continuity of style throughout the piece that we're already looking at. It doesn't look like it requires jagged lines. And certainly the acanthus pieces I showed you earlier don't look like they want jagged lines to be there either. That wouldn't be the way we would do it, though certainly artistically you could do whatever you want. You can do something distressed if that's the way you want to do it. But if we're talking about what makes sense with the artistic piece itself, that's what we're talking about. And just to show you a couple other really brief examples before we finish up here for the day, here's another thing that I always talk about as far as kind of thinking about these things. Interlaced monograms. In kind of directing someone on how to break a monogram apart, I did a very quick rendition of one of those monograms here. If we look at this interlaced monogram here, this CSH kind of monogram, looking at this piece, we can also see number one, the S and the H, are the central bar of the S and the H are essentially being used as the same bar here. But just to show you the difference between these pieces, if we look at the original kind of outline of this artwork, it's not necessarily obvious how we're going to separate this up or break it. And in this case, edges aren't quite enough. Certainly it helps. We're going to look at this piece and say, I've got a corner here and a corner here. Well, if I have a continuous stroke here, that line should match from here to here. It's a straight line, so that's pretty easy. If we're going from here to here, we can see, all right, that curvature should maintain throughout that piece, and we're matching the curvature. Luckily with letters, the reason that makes it so easy with a letter is that a letter is very obvious. We know that we're not supposed to have weird dips and shapes in it, and the shapes in letters are pretty regular, even when they're artistic, even when they are made for some decorative purpose. Now, the difference between that and this over here is that we've also incorporated interlace. Now, interlace as much as it sounds, right? Interlace, something is laced through something else. Now, in the case of a traditional interlace and a piece like this, the easiest way to think about it is to understand that we have a distinct over and under pattern that generally, like a basket weave, like anything else, will want to go over one and under one. Now, can we break this pattern? Surely. But that's an easy way for us to kind of figure out where we want to go. The truth of the matter is, however, we don't have a map as to which thing goes over and which one goes under. But once we make a decision as to which piece goes over and which piece goes under, usually the rest of it can become pretty obvious because we decide first that this stroke, the bottom of the H, is going under the C. Well, then forevermore, we know we're going over one and then under one, and we're going to repeat that pattern throughout. Then it's just about trying to figure out the sequence to make it make sense so we don't have to jump and trim. And in this case, then we can say, all right, we're going under here. Well, then it's over the next one, under, over, under, and we're done. And by doing that, we can then look at the rest of these junctions and plan them out and say, all right, note that on our art. We wouldn't have to be very clean or clear about it. We can just note on the art somewhere in our design or draw with our straight stitch tool or with our vector tools where we're going to make those different jumps happen, or not drums, but these different interlace moments happen. And then we have to work on the piece to make it make sense physically, to make it actually run that way. So though this doesn't have any underlay planned onto it, let's just kind of run this piece through. And I'm being very not very careful. I haven't run this one through first. I think I just did this to show how it was put together, but we can kind of still see what's going on here. Starting from this first piece, we can see that this goes underneath. So we're starting from the first piece of this C up there into the top of the H, and you can see that we did a tab here. We're going to connect back to that later because it needs to look like it's going under, but it can't go under for the entire round of the piece. So we're going to actually come back to that stroke later, but that makes it look like that C is going over here, even though we're going to finish the rest of this satin later on. And that's something I often do, what I call tabs. If I'm trying to make something look like it's interlaced, but the sequence can't really run that way, I can fake it by making the junction look the way I want it to look by dropping in that tab. So you see there's a tab there. We've got another tab here. And we connect back to it later so that it makes it look like I had run that entire piece. That way it looks like it was over and under, even though that this second portion runs later. Back in again, we've this piece that's going to go under. And then we connect back up to it. We've got another one of those tabs here. Then that one goes over. Then we have the bottom of that H. Go back over, run a portion of the C, and then tab out, connect to the original stroke. So we can see what I'm talking about here with interlace. Same kind of thing. We do a little bit of pre-planning, but what are we looking for again? We're looking for where the edge shows us that there is a junction. And then we're looking for continuity of line so that the curvature makes sense with the existing structures that we're looking at. And I would say this piece is not entirely perfect. There's some alignment where I could probably do a little bit closer work on it. But we can see that overall, we're using those same cues to make that happen. I can see a little portion here that doesn't look like it's lining quite correctly on screen that I would probably adjust. But I did this one just as a way to kind of show people what I was talking about. But like I said, this same sort of structure work, I think it is very similar to the acanthus work. It's very similar to the rest of the work that we've seen. So we run through any of these. These have multiple colors because of the multiple colors of thread we used. But we can see once again, leaflets, leaves running over, and we're planning ahead to cover our junctions. Same kind of similar thing going on throughout. And in this case, we've got a central boss and a floret. If we go back out to our acanthus heart again, let's go back out and take a look at that. Just run it by and we can kind of just get our head around these concepts. Continuity of line, hints from the edges, layering in such a way that it is logical for the piece. In this case, with the flowers, we're going from the tip back to that central spine. Copy and paste if you want to. Whenever things are completely identical, you can actually sequence them in such a way that it works for copy and paste, like our friend the shamrock here, who has those 3 radial kind of lobes that turn. But the pre-planning is not quite so onerous as you might think. It sounds like there's a ton of planning to be done. It's really less planning and more a set of loose rules. Very much like this monogram. The interlace being over under every time, that rule is in place and everything comes out of that rule organically. It's not that I'm going to spend a bunch of time planning all this. It's that I'm going to say, all right, if this piece is under, the rest of it falls right into place. And then it's about establishing those rules and finding a sequence. And any piece that you do that's similar is going to have those kind of rules. Trees and leaves are great because they grow in a way that's organic in the first place. That's how they're put together. And it's fairly easy to do. Even the little star on the top of this little Christmas tree. Even when we talk about something that seems really large and difficult to put together, now this one has more moving parts going on. We have lots of big filled areas. We've got these overlap stitches for the ropes. But as we get into the actual strokes themselves, as you can see, the little foliations, the pieces that are there, the way that the fringe builds from the outside to the top, all of these are built for dimension and they are very organic. And it's all about that set of rules that started the entire process of what goes on top, what goes next, and how things grow kind of organically. And certainly there's other stuff. When we have things that are multiple colors, we can start to get into more this mantling around this helmet for coat of arms is another kind of acanthus work that you'll see. Certainly, if we look, however, at the piece before we have all the outlining on it, this is an older piece of mine, you can still see that same attitude of making the leaflets and building back toward the stem makes sense for this mantling in the same way. Is there more going on here? Surely. And once we get into the outlines, then we're back into slightly fuzzier territory as far as where we're going with our sequencing. We may do it a little differently, but even if we think about how I'm breaking up the flat planes of this helmet, you can see that I'm working up toward the top dimensionally and that I'm breaking it. If we look at where these corners are broken, yes, it's real structures, but what's part of the way that I knew where those structures were? I'm looking at the edge of the helmet and deciding, all right, here it is. There's a place where we should break apart. Now, this one has some lines in there to help me understand it. But if you were trying to break structures, it's very similar. You're just looking at the hints that are given to you. Now, once again, if we look at the outlining, to some degree, you're outlining in a very similar way that you would building up. You're still working from the tips up into these back strokes and covering up. Very similar way of working, though you'll find that in the outlining, you're probably getting away with a little bit more than you might be with if you were doing it in a single color. When we have multiple colors, we can do things like hide travel stitches. And in this case, we don't have a lot of that going on aside from in between the different color blocks. You can see that I'm going out and using these pieces more than once, that I'm working out into these areas. If this was completely symmetrical, you could copy and paste it if you wanted to. but it's not. So he still had to build a bunch of it manually. But as we can see, that we are going back and forth to different sides and there's travel stitching there, and that gets hidden. So there are things that are a little less direct. You don't have to do quite the same amount of like tabbing and workarounds that you would do in that single monogram, where you're trying to hide the fact that you might not be traveling in the same direction. In this case, I can use traveling stitches that are eventually going to be covered by other areas or by the outlines, but it still works in a fairly organic way that's kind of based on rules, you know? And I think that's the thing. When we look at it, it's easy to see this as being immensely complicated, but when we break it down to how do I build this structure here? Well, it's how do I build a satin stitch? How do I deal with the interaction between the two shapes? And how do I grow that organically out into the shape? And once I know those rules, I know where I must start my design. I know where I must travel to make it work. And so these pieces kind of follow naturally along once we think about how those structures work and what's the best way to employ those stitch types. And I think that's interesting. So suffice it to say, yes, I know some of that still seems like, if I run through one of those designs very quickly, it seems like, wow, that's a lot to take in. There's a lot going on, but there's not really a ton of difference between, you know, that piece and the acanthus heart. It's a matter of, certainly there's more complexity involved, but if we look at that multicolor piece versus the acanthus heart, the same work is going on in the individual strokes. The same work is going on as to how I'm building up from those central elements. The same work is going on as far as traveling. But I would say honestly that in a single color rendition where I can't hide any travel, where I can't hide anything about the direction that I'm moving, then there's a lot less that I can do as far as cheating this system. And I actually have to be more careful. This is probably a little more nerve wracking to sequence, as much as it doesn't look like it would be, than something like this, where I actually have a little bit of leeway with traveling and working underneath other colors. So suffice it to say, yes, there's pre-planning. Yes, there are different elements that go into it. However, like most things in embroidery, like most things in this kind of, honestly, in any kind of decoration, but certainly in embroidery, when we're dealing with these shapes, these compound shapes, it is similar to anything else in embroidery, in which I think everything grows out of the elemental understanding of the stitch. We know that big flat areas work well with fill stitches. We know things about fill stitches, that if they are very regular, if the pattern is regular, they look smooth. They look shinier if the pattern is regular. The longer the individual stitches are, even in a fill stitch pattern, that will make a shinier look to the piece. It'll look a little smoother. Really short stitches look pebbly. They have more shadows involved in them. Also, we know that irregular satin stitches, like randomized satin stitches, look more organic. So we think about that and we're like, all right, I have an area that is a wide area I want to cover, and I want it to look organic, but I don't want it to be split and ridged like it would be if I overlapped a bunch of satin stitches together on it. Sounds like I want a randomized fill stitch or a patterned fill stitch in that area. Now I can say, all right, how am I going to draw this object, and what angle will I set at this piece? Or do I use a curved angle? And I can say, all right, if I'm going to use a curved stitch type, then I will look at the piece and say, what curvature makes sense for this object? And if it's not a real object, I say, what curvature is going to produce the effect on the light that I want? And what other shapes are around this object, and how is that going to influence that contrast between the different angles of stitching, or between the different textures that I want around it? But we start from the understanding of the stitch. Long stitches are loftier and shiny. Shorter stitches are less. Regular patterns are shiny. Irregular patterns are more organic. And then we look at the objects and say, if something is narrow and long, it does well as a satin stitch. If it is ribbon-like, like a stroke, satins are great for that. We can use a fill stitch if we want different textural qualities. We can use a split satin or a length limit satin if we want to have some texture involved but have a satiny edge. Or we have a large area, but we still want that turning stitch. We can use turning fills, or we can use a turning satin, split satin, or length limit auto split, either depending on your software, to create something like you saw in the acanthus hoodie, where I actually did use something that was satin-like, but wasn't a true satin. But the thing is, I know from a set of understandings about the stitches themselves what works best. And I know, because I'm looking at the art at scale, and the piece that I'm eventually going to embroider on, those are all in my head when I'm starting to do my digitizing, what I can get away with. I know that this length is too long for one length of satin, especially if I don't want it to be very loopy and likely to hang and to put a lot of tension on this design or on this fabric. I know I want to split that up, but I know that I don't want a traditional tatami fill. So I'm looking at the qualities that I want to impart on the art and working from the qualities out. I'm working from the size of the art, from the qualities of the stitch type, and I'm imparting those qualities on the piece from there. Then when I start to draw, I can say, all right, if I'm looking at my drawing, where are the edges coming to corners? Where are my insets? How do I get a continuous curve? And what sorts of shapes are present in the structure I'm looking at? Whether that's this piece, whether it's a letter, whether it's a glyph, whether it's acanthus work, whatever it is, I'm looking at the structures that are present and I'm thinking about the qualities of the stitch type that I'm going to use to get what I want out of the piece. So that's what we look for. We look for line, we look for the edge quality, we look for continuity of line to break things apart, and we take into account the elemental understanding of the stitch, the elemental understanding of light and thread, and the elemental understanding of what stitches are good for certain uses and how that affects the final piece. I think that's it. I mean, like I said, I think honestly, it's both simpler and more complicated than people think, because some people think it's going to be very simple just to, click and fill and go for it. You do need to know some things. But once you do, I think that a lot of embroidery really kind of grows organically from those understandings. If we know what a satin stitch does and how it operates, well, then we're always going to know how to compensate for the stresses that it puts on the designs. We're always going to understand what we need to do in our art to make the satin stitch do what it does. We know it's going to get narrower. We know it's going to push out at the ends. So we draw it a little shorter and we draw it a little fatter, and that's going to make our satin stitch look the way we want it to. There's our distortion portion of it. We know that a big wide satin is not always good for a couple different reasons. And so if we're at a certain scale, we'll split things up and use those individual leaflets, not just to make that decorative piece look good, but to make the satin run well, because we want it to be under 10 millimeters wide, because once we get up past 10, it's going to be a little bit difficult and slow. So we take those technical things into account. We take the nature of the stitches into account, and then we look at the design that's in front of us at scale. Make sure and get your screens set up with size. So 1:1 is at scale. So, set those things up. It's in your software. Check it out. Calibrate your screens. We look at our art at scale and we think about that. The other stuff we have to think about, hey, if there's any material choice issues, we've got vertical grain or ribbing in a knit hat or any of that stuff, then we have to work on our underlay. Then we might have to change some stitch angles because we don't want our stitch angles to line up with ribs in our fabric. There are other things we have to think about, so it can get more complicated in a way, but at the same time, it's organic. If we know the basic rules of what thread does, if we know how stitches work, and we know what we want out of our finished piece, we can envision what that embroidery should look like and what that texture is going to do to our piece, what we want out of it, and we have that art in front of us at scale. Now it is a combination of knowing the rules. I know you can break the rules in multiple ways, but the rules of embroidery, in fact, of what works well, what stitch lengths run well, how's it going to work for your final client. Like I said, I've got lots of clients where I use fill stitch and for text that I don't want to, because those clients were in rough areas where catching a loop of their lettering on something, like on a piece of construction work or on a branch, if you're doing like landscaping, is going to rip the thread out. So I had to use those flat stitches. So also the kind of area you're working in. But in general, we're saying, all right, I know what the rules are. I know how a satin stitch works. I know how to fill stitch works. I know what they look good at. As I know what sizes they can be run. I know how long a stitch can get and how small before it gets to be a problem. And then I look at the art that's in front of me and say, here are my opportunities. First, here are my obstacles. Here are places where a satin stitch won't work and where a fill stitch won't look good, or where I can't do it because of the garment's too light. Those are my obstacles, things that are technically not going to work, my vertical ribs that are not going to be good if I line up my fill directly on them, stuff like that. And then we look at what we can do with the stitches we have, with our underlay, with our materials to help with those kind of technical problems. And then we get to have that fun of saying, all right, what's the thing that I can do that makes embroidery look its best? How can embroidery impart a quality on this art that it didn't have without it? That's where we get to do the dimension. That's where we get to play with stitch angles. That's where we get to do the dimensional carving and making something interesting. And if you happen to be like me and you're a little kid looking at the trim inside of a 70s truck and being very enamored of certain little patterns that you find, you can also decide to think about in your head, how would I get those individual patterns up, and how would I how would I carve individual leaves into them? And you can make something a little bit more interesting with it. And like I said, invariably, what is it? It's me looking at the shapes that are there. It's you seeing what's possible and deciding how to make the texture of embroidery interesting for it. It's deciding that though you could ostensibly make something that was just filled in and was one color flat, that even with that single color of thread, the nature of embroidery has something to it that adds a little bit of the sublime. In any case, not to get too serious about it, you can make cool leaves. It's fun. And knowing a little bit about acanthus work never hurt. All right, with that, folks, I'm going to go ahead and let that be it for the day. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you. If you have a chance, like I said, I'll go ahead and put this up one more time. If you want this piece, you can find it for yourself. It is there free over here at the link that I just threw down in the description. I'll throw it up on the banner just in case the comments, every once in a while, the comments, the live chat can't replay. So if you can't get that, go ahead and take your snapshot here now. It's over in the Embrilliance website. You can get that for free and use Embrilliance's Express mode without having to purchase something. If you do have an Embrilliance platform program, very easy just to open it up, scale it, and spit it out in whatever color you want, in whatever file format works for you. You can do that if you actually have the software. But even with no software, you can go get the free mode and run it out of that free mode into whatever software you want. But check that out. Play with it. Let me know what you think. And if you decide to make some cool decorative stuff, some acanthus work, I would love to see more of your work too. And tell me the stuff that you come through, breakthroughs on some of this stuff. If there's any of these lessons that kind of hit for you and you make something awesome and you want to show it off, let me know, because I'm here to celebrate that win with you. And I would love to see your work, because that really is what we love to see. All right. So for the rest of you guys, thank you very much. I love Lena. Thank you for saying that. You just leveled it up again. Thanks for sharing. I'm super happy that it was good for you today, and happy that it's useful for any of you folks. All right. With that, enjoy the day. I hope you have a lucky evening and that the rest of your year has that same blessing on it. And I cannot wait to see you guys again next week.